They called her a bride before she had even grown into a woman. 13 years old, her body still caught between childhood and womanhood, she walked barefoot across a dirt path toward a man who shared not only her bloodline, but her very face. He was her brother, and before the whispers of the community could rise above the treetops, she was already bound to him in vows that were never meant to exist. No church bells rang that day, no flowers lined the aisle, only the heavy silence of a valley that had learned to keep its secrets, and the watchful eyes of kin who had done the same before them. Her name has been lost to official records, erased or misspelled in census ledgers that no one outside the family ever cared to read. But in the Appalachian backcountry, her story still lingers like a sickness, passed down in half-whispered confessions around old kitchen tables. Some say she was fragile, with hollow cheeks and eyes too large for her head. Others remember her as plain, quiet, a girl who never raised her voice even when her fate was sealed. What is certain is this: she did not choose her brother. Choice was a luxury reserved for people whose families were not trapped by isolation, poverty, and the weight of bloodlines that wound too tightly around themselves. America, in the late 19th century, was full of places where the law could not easily reach. Deep hollows, forgotten mountainsides, and towns that did not appear on maps became prisons of tradition, where the boundaries between right and wrong blurred into survival. And in those places, marriages like hers were not seen as monstrous. They were seen as inevitable. Families that could not look outward turned inward, creating unions that carried the same blood from one generation into the next, until faces began to change and minds sometimes broke. For the girl who became a bride that day, there was no escape. Her life was folded into her brother's like pages pressed together in a book that would never be read outside the family home. She became both sister and wife, mother and aunt, her children destined to carry the marks of a lineage too closely bound, and behind the walls of a one-room cabin, she began the slow, suffocating journey of becoming America's most inbred bride. In the silence of her cabin, she lived a life most could not imagine. The walls were made of timber, the floor uneven planks, the windows clouded with grime. But the true prison was invisible, stitched into the fabric of her bloodline. Every meal, every whispered prayer, every child born in that cabin tied her more tightly to a history she could never outrun. The neighbors, if they could even be called that, rarely spoke of her directly. They knew, but they pretended not to. In communities where everyone's family tree curled back on itself, pointing fingers was dangerous. What you condemned in another, you might find staring back at you in your own kin. The girl's brother, her husband, was older, stronger, but no more free. He had grown up with the same quiet rules: never question, never stray too far, keep the bloodline safe by keeping it close. To him, the marriage was not wicked, but expected, a role handed down like an heirloom. Still, the silence between them grew heavy. At night she lay awake, listening to the mountain winds rattle the cabin, wondering if the world beyond the ridges was as cruel as the world within. Over time, the children came. Some lived, some did not. The ones who did often bore the unmistakable marks of what happens when bloodlines collapse inward. Narrow jaws, crossed eyes, fragile bodies that struggled to hold the weight of life. To outsiders, these children became proof of what the family had done. To their mother, they were only her babies, and she carried them on her hip through the fields, feeding them scraps of cornbread and broth, rocking them to sleep in the same cradle that had held her. But the truth lingered in every crooked smile and sunken face. She could not escape it. The marriage had not only bound her to her brother, it had carved itself into her children, into their children after them, into a lineage forever marked by choices she never made. And though her name was lost, the legacy of her union became something darker than memory. It became evidence, a living archive of what happens when isolation, desperation, and silence conspire to erase the boundaries of kinship. Her story is not unique. That's what makes it so haunting. She was one of many, hidden in valleys and hollows across America, where the soil grew thin, the money ran out, and families turned to themselves for answers. And the cost of those answers can still be seen in faces today. By the turn of the century, the whispers surrounding her family had grown louder. Outsiders who passed through spoke of them with unease, recounting faces that seemed strangely familiar, as though the same features repeated themselves again and again across generations. Crooked teeth, wide-set eyes, uneven jaws. It was as if the family had been carved from a single mold and simply reshaped, never refreshed. The girl who had married her brother at 13 was now a woman, but the weight of that childhood vow never lifted. Every glance at her children reminded her that she had carried forward something fragile, something already broken before it had begun. Communities like hers thrived on secrecy, but secrecy is a fragile thing. Census takers occasionally came, writing down names and ages that barely scratched the surface of truth. Ministers sometimes tried to intervene, urging families to look beyond blood, but their voices were carried away by the wind before they could take root. And so the cycle continued, each generation folding in on itself like an echo, each child born into a destiny written long before their first breath. The woman, now no longer a girl, lived through it all with quiet resignation. She fetched water from the creek, patched the same clothes year after year, cooked meals over a fire that filled the cabin with smoke. To the outside world, these were just the marks of poverty, but to those who looked closer, they were also the marks of captivity. She had never left the valley, never seen the world beyond the ridges. Her life was a closed circle, the same path walked again and again, her footsteps worn into the dirt floor like grooves of inevitability. And yet, even within that silence, there was fear that one day someone from the outside would pry too deeply, uncover too much, fear that the children's faces would speak louder than the family's denials. Because the truth, no matter how tightly hidden, has a way of seeping out, and when it did, it would not only condemn her, it would condemn an entire bloodline. What makes her story so haunting is not simply the marriage itself, but the way it was absorbed into the fabric of the community. No one stopped it. No one pulled her away from the cabin door when she walked toward her brother that day, and in that silence lies the heaviest guilt of all. Time does not erase wounds like these, it only buries them deeper. By the time she reached middle age, the girl who had once been forced into a wedding dress of rags now carried the face of quiet suffering. Her body bent under years of childbirth and labor, her eyes dulled by the constant shadow of the mountains that had held her captive since birth. She was not remembered for laughter or song, but for her silence. A silence that became its own language, spoken by generations of women who had endured the same fate. The children grew, and with them, the rumors. Some were withdrawn, their minds clouded, their words halting and strange. Others bore a resemblance too sharp, as if the mother and the uncle-father had been stamped into them with no variation. Families nearby began to whisper that the blood was no longer clean, that something unnatural was twisting itself into the marrow of the children. Still, no one intervened. Survival demanded unity, and unity demanded silence. To expose one family was to risk exposing them all. And so the cycle deepened. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, and the valley became a kind of living archive of genetic entanglement. What had begun as a single marriage between a girl and her brother became a tradition, a rule that no one had written down, but everyone obeyed. It was not spoken of in the open, but it shaped every birth, every death, every union for decades to come. For the woman, there was no undoing it. The children she bore became adults who carried forward the same curse. The bloodline that had begun with her marriage did not end. It expanded, branched outward like a tree whose roots curled back into themselves. Each generation carried the face of the last, distorted slightly, but never free. And still she endured. She endured the births and the funerals, the hunger and the sickness, the way the outside world begs, and to look at her family with both disgust and fascination. In her endurance lies the true horror, not the wedding day itself, not even the children marked by it, but the fact that life continued as though this was normal. Her suffering became routine, her silence became expected, and in that routine, the most disturbing truth of all emerges: the inhuman can become ordinary if it is repeated long enough. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Because by now, you've realized this isn't just a story about one girl. It's a mirror held up to a part of America that most would rather forget. When we talk about hidden histories, we often imagine ancient ruins, dusty archives, forgotten wars. But sometimes, history hides not in books, but in blood. And once you start to see it, you cannot look away. The children of her bloodline spread out through the valley, and each generation bore the unmistakable marks of what had been done. Some were quiet, staring too long at the ground, their words stumbling out in broken phrases. Others laughed at the wrong times, their minds never quite finding balance. Neighbors began to keep their distance, yet they watched with morbid curiosity, whispering stories that carried far beyond the mountains. Outsiders came to see them like spectacles, proof of something unnatural preserved in flesh. What was once secrecy became legend, and legend became a stain. The woman who had once been a child bride watched this unfold with hollow eyes. She could not protect her children from the looks, from the labels, from the destiny written into their bones. Every crooked smile, every faltering step, every strange sound they made in place of words reminded her of the day she was led to the cabin as a bride. She had carried her family forward, but she had also carried their curse. And yet she remained invisible. No photograph survives of her, no grave marker bears her name. Her story exists only in fragments, in the way neighbors remembered her silence, in the way her children's faces carried proof of choices she never made. She became a ghost long before she died, erased from memory, yet immortalized in the bodies of her descendants. This is the part of American history no one teaches. It is not written in schoolbooks or spoken of in polite company. It exists in the shadows, whispered, denied, buried, but never gone, because blood remembers even when names are forgotten. And in the mountains of Appalachia, her blood still lingers, marking those who carry it with the weight of a secret the world was never meant to see. As the decades passed, the valley that once held her captive began to change. Roads crept closer, towns expanded, and outsiders ventured into places once thought unreachable. And with them came questions. Doctors, journalists, curious travelers. They all caught glimpses of the family, their strange resemblance, their halting speech, their bodies that seemed to echo the same fragile design. What had once been a private shame became a public fascination. The family's name, though I will not speak it here, became a symbol, a shorthand for inbreeding in America, a living cautionary tale that outsiders repeated with both horror and fascination. But for her, the girl who had been forced into marriage at 13, none of this mattered. By the time the world took notice, her life was already over. She had lived and died within the same narrow circle, a prisoner of blood, buried in a grave no one can find. And yet she remained. Every newspaper article, every whispered tale, every photograph of her descendants carried her shadow forward. She could not escape history, because history had built itself upon her body. This is where the story grows most unsettling, because the truth is, she was not a monster. She was a child stripped of choice, bound by family, silenced by poverty, and remembered only for what was done to her. When we speak of her as the most inbred bride in America, we forget the person beneath the label. We forget the quiet girl who once may have dreamed of something beyond the mountains, who once may have wished for a life not bound to her brother's shadow. And in forgetting her humanity, we repeat the same cruelty her community committed, reducing her to a symbol when she was first and foremost a victim. Her story is not only about bloodlines collapsing inward, it is about silence, complicity, and the cost of survival in a land where the law could not or would not intervene. It is about a child turned into a bride, a family turned into a legend, and a secret turned into a stain that no amount of time can wash away. And if we listen closely, we find that her story is not entirely gone. It still whispers through the hollows, reminding us that history's darkest truths are never as distant as we would like to believe. And so we arrive at the end, though her story never truly ends. The girl who was married to her brother at 13 has become something more than a person. She is a haunting presence in the American memory, a shadow on the mountains, a reminder of what happens when poverty, isolation, and silence twist together into something unspeakable. Her life was brief, ordinary in its routines, extraordinary only in the horror that framed it. Yet it is precisely this ordinariness that unsettles us most. Because what happened to her was not an accident, it was a system. A pattern repeated so many times that it became invisible until the faces of her descendants could no longer hide it. We do not know her name, but we know her legacy. We know it in the way her bloodline carried forward, bending under the weight of too much sameness. We know it in the faces that outsiders photographed decades later, faces that looked like echoes of a single broken chord. We know it in the fascination and revulsion that still lingers when her story is told, proof that some wounds do not heal but instead seep outward, staining generation after generation. Perhaps the most chilling truth is that her story is not unique. Across the country, hidden in valleys and forgotten towns, families like hers lived and died in silence. Their stories were buried, their graves unmarked, their children remembered only through whispers of deformity and madness. They were erased, not because they were rare, but because they were too close to what America wanted to believe about itself, too close to the myth of progress, purity, and order. In the end, she remains nameless, faceless, a ghostly figure standing at the threshold of memory. But perhaps that is fitting, for she was never allowed to be herself. She was only ever her family's property, her community's silence, her children's curse, and now our affliction. When we speak of her, we do not just exhume the past. We confront the fragile line between survival and horror, between tradition and tragedy, between blood and ash. And as long as her story is remembered, she forces us to ask a question we would rather avoid. If silence could allow this to happen once, what else has been buried, waiting in the dark for someone willing to see?